is a human right. So thank you for listening to that about the Women's Hospitality Network. Later on, I can post the website for folks who want to check it out. But now I'm excited. I get to introduce to you Dr. DeBorah Gilbert White, and she is a diversity and inclusion specialist, social justice and community advocate for people experiencing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, or formerly homeless. She is founder of HerStory Ensemble LLC, an awareness, education, and advocacy community-based group focused on women and homelessness. She serves as a member of the National Coalition for Homeless Faces of Homeless Speakers Bureau, where she shares her story, work connected to homelessness. HerStory Ensemble LLC is a member organization of the National Coalition for Homelessness, Delaware Continuum of Care, and Delaware Housing Opportunity Mobile Equity and Stability Campaign. She and her organization work as advocates locally and nationally for protective homeless policy and legislation. DeBorah's experience with her shelter homelessness led her advocacy work for homeless rights and housing justice. She has been working in community since 2012 towards a Delaware Bill of Rights for individuals experiencing homelessness and to dismantle stereotypes, myths, and misinformation about homelessness. Her work continues today to eliminate discrimination based on housing status, to stop the criminalization of the homelessness, and to promote more low-income and affordable housing. Dr. White is author of Beyond Charity, a Sojourner's reflection on homelessness, advocacy, empowerment, and hope. So if everybody can get their hands together and just clap to welcome Dr. DeBorah.
Good morning, and thank you so much to each of you. So far, the program has been wonderful in sharing the work that you are already doing, and I thank God for people like you and people in community who are seeing the needs and meeting the needs of people who are facing homelessness, at risk of homelessness, or experiencing homelessness. I appreciate this opportunity to spend this time in conversation about a most timely and personal topic, housing and homelessness. We will spend time sharing about what challenges, past and present, we face in the U.S. Related to housing and homelessness, and to push for home housing as a human right. As someone who can be identified as former shelter homeless, I know that I bring a unique perspective to the subject matter, not only as someone with a lived experience of homelessness, but also as a social scientist and as a community advocate for people experiencing homelessness, formerly homeless, and at risk of homelessness. Coming out of the experience, I wrote a book, as Derek referred to earlier, and it is titled Beyond Charity, a Sojourner's Reflections on Homelessness, Advocacy, Empowerment, and Hope. And it not only shares my story, but provides opportunity for engagements such as this to lift the message of protecting the rights of people experiencing homelessness and the justice inherent in having housing as a human right. I wrote the book to expand the narrative about homelessness and, more importantly, to shake the tree, to help move us toward embracing housing as a human right and not a commodity, and to bring about transformative change for how homelessness is addressed. I take this opportunity to thank my friend and fellow advocate, the Reverend Canon Jane Oasin, for inviting me into this space. Jane and I met doing ecumenical anti-racism work when I served as national staff with the United Church of Christ. And please excuse me because I'm on one device and I'm working two devices here. So if it looks like I'm doing something, that's what I'm doing. Okay. HerStory Ensemble and Community Empowerment Institute are part of the same program. This presentation is part of the Community Empowerment Institute work, where we connect with groups and organizations in the community around social justice considerations connected to homelessness and its emerging issues. Today, I am joined by 4 friends and allies who will now introduce themselves and share in 2 sentences what brings them to the space and this issue. You will connect with them more later in the presentation.
I am Mary Alice Saunders. a proud Episcopalian and also a proud member of the Union of Black Episcopalians. I retired several years ago as an assistant professor of nursing at a Catholic college, where I also served as the diversity officer. And in my role in nursing, I've had an opportunity to encounter homelessness up close and personal, particularly with domestic violence. I'm a member of the St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Cleveland Heights and a newly formed committee, the Racial Justice Committee. And I am so honored that DeBorah has asked me to be a part of this crucial work that is being done. One last sentence, DeBorah. I know I'm talking too much, but I am so impressed with the Diocese of New Jersey and what you are doing. And I will certainly pray for your work. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Valerie Ray. I'm a college student, currently in pursuit of human services degree at one of these colleges here in New York, and will continue on with my bachelor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, pursuing human services and community service degree. I've also experienced homeless because of an intimate partner violence issue. I was homeless for over 2 years. I was in various settings, congregational, transitional setting. I was on the street, going from the trains, sleeping in train stations and bus terminals. And the Lord blessed me to finally get my apartment. And I'm very thrilled to be here and very impressed by your organization.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Welch. I'm in Cleveland, Ohio. I am a former college faculty and administrator. And through that experience, went on to do further work to become a diversity and inclusion, equity and belonging consultant. I work with mission-driven organizations. I am very, very pleased, DeBorah, to support you this morning, to support this community. And I will echo Mary Alice. I am very impressed with the Diocese of New Jersey.
Good morning. My name is Minnie White. Friends with DeBorah. We work together as colleagues with the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. I've not experienced homelessness in the traditional sense, but more of housing insecurity and displacement when I lost my home. But I come from a very large family, and I have a very large family network. So where I never experienced homelessness in the traditional sense. I did what some of my elderly friends call, I lived from pillar to post. I lived on the couches and Goodwill and spare bedrooms of a lot of family and friends. And I'm very proud to be part of this process today.
Thank you all, and thank you all for saying yes. And I'm glad that you're here and we're all in this space together to learn from each other and with each other. Today, we ask that you participate to the fullest of your ability as we seek to build community, the beloved community, in this process and a wider process. We will have opportunities to have small group discussion. If you are able to have your camera on, that would be greatly appreciated. And be present, listen actively, and use I statements when speaking in large or small group activity. And also we ask that you choose courage over comfort and to also make space for grace. Preparing for our time together, I wanted our engagements to be one that provided reflection on what it means to be a beloved community. Dr. King helped us to visualize it by speaking to those things that were barriers to attaining it, among them poverty, hunger, and homelessness. The work of the Episcopal Community Services, ECS, is important and necessary, but you already know that. I want our time together today to not only focus on what ECS does, but also on how the work is done and the relationships you have with those you connect with around the work. So let's take a moment to think about the beloved community that we are building. Please take a moment to put in the chat what comes to mind when you think about the beloved community. What would we find in such a community? What would we need? Phyllis, what are you seeing there for us? What are they saying?
We got lots of love. That's one of the love and acceptance, I think, are two of the most prominent ones that I'm seeing coming through. Inclusion and welcoming, collective liberation, care, support, and lifting up, people meeting as equals, honoring each other's gifts, support, kindness, and fulfillment of rights. All members of the community feel like they belong in the community and are welcomed by others. Grace, housing, food, and water as a human right.
Yes.
Resources to help others. Advocacy. You want me to keep going?
You said a whole lot there, and that's what we would need. All of that is what we would need to have the beloved community. We should be able to find that in the beloved community. And so as we move forward, we're going to talk about poverty and homelessness. Why have we not attained the beloved community yet, and what we would need to do that. Working toward the beloved community requires addressing the pertinent issues of the day. We cannot talk about being a beloved community without addressing those things that make and keep people poor. We cannot focus on homelessness without talking about poverty. A historical reflection of poverty in the United States provides us with information regarding the treatment of people identified as poor to be harsh and stigmatizing. People deemed destitute or poor were separated from other members of society. They could be banned from towns or placed in what was known as workhouses. And workhouses were public institutions originating in England, which were brought to the New World, quote unquote, where the most vulnerable people of society, those who did not have housing, orphan children, and others deemed unable to care for themselves, would live and experience hard labor for room and board. In the late 1600s, poor people without housing in Massachusetts and other places could be put into workhouses, which were often combined with jails. And if we think now, some of that continues to happen in our present time. Here we find that people surviving in such situations experience citizenship rights withdrawn. People who are incarcerated not being able to come out and be able to vote. Rights withdrawn, families were separated, and they were generally looked down upon by others. Here we find the early institutions that laid the groundwork for how we as society would live into how we perceive the poor. Those among us with less, those among us deemed different, and those among us needing to ask for help. As a social psychologist, I am drawn to examining and understanding social stigma. That is, why and how people holding particular social identities or group memberships in a society are treated, quote unquote, less than, are made to feel and are treated as if they do not belong, and find themselves punished by society in various ways for their circumstance or for who they are. Social stigma is characterized as an attribute that is socially defined as deeply discrediting, spoiling one's identity, and disqualifying one from social acceptance. Stigma involves both extreme negative perceptions and social rejection of the marked individual or group. People identified as poor have been stigmatized for centuries. Prevailing attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions about people identified as poor continue to blame people experiencing poverty for their own condition. There continues to be a perpetuation to place fault or causation on individual behaviors, such as poor money management, unwillingness to work hard, or lack of ability or talent, or what some would consider moral considerations, such as alcohol and substance abuse, rather than economic are social factors such as the lack of a living wage or housing wage, scarcity of jobs, poor education, and discrimination in various forms. Basically, people experience homelessness because they do not have housing, and society does not have enough housing to support its needs. It would seem that the simple fix would be to build the housing that is needed so that everyone can have access to housing they can afford. Research indicates that people identified as poor, among people identified as poor, people experiencing homelessness are the most stigmatized. Understanding that people experience homelessness for various reasons, from natural disasters to evictions, to not having access to low-income affordable housing stock, to having to flee abusive situations, it is important to have a clear understanding of how homelessness is defined. How homelessness is defined has been a point of contention for housing and homeless activists and advocates, as the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, has limited the definition to those who are surviving on the streets or staying in shelters. It's problematic because it is only part of the reality and part of the narrative. According to the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, National Health Care for the Homeless Council, National Policy and Advocacy Council on Homelessness, and others, including state and local entities, working with the issue of homelessness, this definition does not take into account other homeless situations, such as individuals and families staying with others, which we call doubling up, or people living in motels on their own dime because they have no other place to go. Across the country, homelessness is defined in much broader terms, as you can see on the screen, from an individual who will lose housing within 14 days, unaccompanied youth or guardian, a child that does not have housing, and as an individual who is fleeing or attempting to flee from domestic violence. Okay, I'm still manipulating here, sorry. When I started my journey of homeless advocacy, I knew that it called for all of us to begin to tell the full story about homelessness by expanding the narrative. Expanding the narrative involves having a working definition that tells the truth. We must ask the hard questions, one being, what purpose does it serve to limit how homelessness is defined? Another being, how does that impact ending it? It is important to note that there are other federal definitions of homelessness, most notably the first U.S. homeless legislation known as the Mckinney-Vento Act, which ensured that every child identified as homeless receives an education. Children and youth are, it defines homelessness for children and youth as individuals who lack a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. This definition takes into consideration children and youth in motels, those sharing the housing of others due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or similar reasons. Another federal definition is connected to women and families experiencing homelessness due to domestic violence. The Violence Against Women's Act includes the language of the Mckinney-Vento Act to recognize the specific needs of women and children fleeing from domestic violence. Lastly, there is the Department of Labor's definition that supports veterans who are experiencing homelessness and making sure that they have housing when they are in intimate need of losing their housing within 14 days. So we know that homelessness is defined in many different ways, and to have a broader narrative about it will help us more to be able to address it. At this point, I would like to read an excerpt from my book connected to the issue of homelessness, and this is what I experienced. I'm writing here about what I experienced and what I saw coming from my first congressional briefing when I moved to DC, and there was a briefing on extreme poverty in the United States. This is what I said. In DC, the new year provided an invitation to the congressional briefing on extreme poverty, my first briefing on Capitol Hill. It was at this meeting that I gained a deeper sense of the issues and work being done connected to poverty around the world, in the United States and in local communities. While driving home from that congressional briefing, I viewed a man standing in the street in the cold. Sitting in the second car stopped at a 2-lane traffic light, I observed him approach the cars in both lanes in front of mine, asking for help. He was a frail African-American male wearing oversized clothing, holding a small clear plastic cup, which he held between his hands. His hands were placed around the cup as if he were praying. He looked so broken. I watched him move between each car. The image fits many stereotypes about the homeless before he reached my car. I could feel the tears welling up. I reached into my pocket, lowered my window, and then he got to me, dropped the coins in his cup. I heard him say, "Thank you." As the light changed, my thoughts went to the meeting I just left and the bumper sticker on my car, "Everyone deserves a home." And I began to wonder about the man's story. He was someone's child, possibly he was someone's brother, husband, or dad. What had brought this seemingly gentle man to ask for help on the streets in the nation's capital on this cold winter day? I wondered if I was witnessing humility, defeat, or both. By the time I made the turn onto my street, the tears were rolling, and I thought we must do better. My coins may have helped him this day, but they did nothing for the broader change needed. I was reminded that charity was not a useful weapon in battles for social change. In March 2021, HUD released its annual Homeless Assessment Report Part 1 to Congress. The report indicated an increase in homelessness overall, with a disproportionate number of people who do not identify as white experiencing homelessness. According to the report, African Americans and indigenous people, including Native Americans and Pacific Islanders, remain considerably overrepresented among the homeless population compared to the US population. Almost 4 of every 10 people experiencing homelessness in January 2020 were Black or African American. A higher percentage of people in shelters were Black or African American than were people experiencing homelessness in unsheltered locations. Almost a quarter of all people experiencing homelessness were Hispanic or Latino, counting people of all races who identify as Hispanic or Latino. Together, American Indian, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Native Hawaiian populations account for 1% of the US population, but 5% of the homeless population and 7% of the unsheltered population. These findings shed light on the racial impact of homelessness. We know that housing justice is racial justice. The report lifted a key fact that there was an increase in homelessness occurring before the COVID-19 pandemic. We have seen and continue to see the impact of the pandemic on individuals and families. In the beginning of the pandemic and now, the lack of low-income, affordable, safe housing continues to be a factor in people remaining housed or becoming homeless. The lack of emergency shelter beds was an issue before COVID-19 and has become a major concern during COVID-19, with congregate settings needing to practice social distancing. With shelters operating at 50% capacity in many places, the availability of beds is further diminished. While some people were still able to maintain housing due to eviction moratoriums, while some people were still able to do that, there was still a need for emergency shelter for those who found themselves without housing as we enter the coldest time of the year, then and now. The pandemic served to highlight for us all that people working every day can be very close to losing housing. The economic challenges of COVID-19 has brought that reality to the forefront. In early 2020, before COVID-19 closed schools, there were approximately 1.5 million public school students identified as homeless in the United States. I'll say that again, 1.5 million. This was also shared in the HUD report mentioned earlier, along with the information that 50% of families experiencing homelessness also identified as African American. Both statistics brought to the forefront the housing disparity and educational challenges for students without housing, and particularly for those who identify as Black or African American. Whether individuals and families find themselves surviving on streets, living in cars, moving from place to place or staying in shelters or motels, there are challenges to meeting the basic needs, not contracting COVID-19, and students having the ability to get an education. Students experiencing homelessness during the pandemic have faced all that comes with experiencing homelessness, like the lack of internet access or access to computers, and being schoolless, quote unquote, by not having access to a school building that for many provided safety, meals, and a space to be with their peers and supportive adults. Last October, an article in the Detroit News shared the obstacles faced by students without housing and without a school building. The school building for students identified as homeless represents more than a space or place for academic achievement. The building becomes a place where they encounter a sense of stability and routine for their existence. They have a place to go each day where they know they belong. It is a place where they have some level of commonality with others, housed or unhoused. And even when so many of them may know that they will be, when so many of them do not know where they will be sleeping at night. Students recognize the school building as a place where they would have something to eat through its breakfast and lunch offerings. They were engaged in after-school programs and activities. Often it is the school personnel who are the first to see signs or identify students experiencing homelessness. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke to being dissatisfied with the conditions of the day. There are too many still experiencing hunger, homelessness, job loss, housing insecurity, low wages, and other uncertainties. What do we really need to do that will prevent new people becoming homeless and house those who are already experiencing homelessness? What do we need to really do? With all the monies coming into states and cities to support homeless service providers during and beyond COVID-19, how much more needs to be directed to homeless prevention? Where are the strategies and monies for low-cost, affordable housing? It seems that we have more questions than answers. We must not only do good, but be good in ways that move us to address the justice issues connected to housing. As we reflect on the beloved community, we have yet to totally experience the society and world that Dr. King imagined. According to the National Low Income Coalition, across New Jersey, there is a shortage of rental homes, affordable and available to extremely low income households whose incomes are below the poverty guidelines of 30% of their area median income. Many of these households are severely cost burdened, spending more than half of their income on housing. Severely cost burdened poor households are more likely than other renters to sacrifice other necessities like healthy food and healthcare to pay the rent, and to experience unstable housing situations like evictions. When I started doing homeless advocacy work, because I had done anti-racism work, I really did not want to look at homelessness and housing through a racial justice lens. I had been burnt out. And I just wanted to look at just dealing with the issue of homelessness. So when I saw this report, the Spark report, I thank God. I really was happy to see this report done. The executive summary of the Spark report states that people of color are dramatically more likely than white people to experience homelessness in the United States. And this is no accident. It is the result of centuries of structural racism that have excluded historically oppressed people, particularly Black and Native Americans, from equal access to housing, community supports, and opportunities for economic mobility. This report represents an investigation that began in 2016 to understand and respond to racial inequities and homelessness. The Spark team documented high rates of homelessness among people of color in 6 communities across the United States. The communities in its study were Atlanta, Georgia, Columbus, Ohio, Dallas, Texas, San Francisco, California, Syracuse, New York, and Pierce County, Washington. It is important to note that people of color here refers to all people in its study who do not identify as white, but young people identifying as Black or African American. The SPARK team's work mapped the pathways into and barriers to exit from homelessness. They're finding that poverty alone does not explain racial inequities, further supported the impact of systemic factors such as harmful policies and practices at the institutional level and structural, educational, health, and economy racism. The report indicates that the portion of Black and American, Indian, and Alaskan Native individuals experiencing homelessness exceeds their proportion of those living in deep poverty. This report sought to answer, one, how rates of homelessness for people of color compare to the general population and the population of people living in deep poverty. Two, pathways into homelessness for people of color. Three, barriers to exiting homelessness for people of color. And four, experiences of people of color within the homeless response system. Other research highlights economic mobility, which is a lack of economic capital within social networks, which precipitates homelessness for many people of color. Housing, the unavailability of safe and affordable housing options presents both risk of homelessness and barriers to permanently exiting homelessness. Criminal justice involvement in the criminal justice system, especially when such involvement results in a felony, can create ongoing challenges in obtaining jobs and housing. We cannot talk about advocacy, poverty, housing, homelessness without talking about power and privilege. And so to get an understanding of what power and privilege is, systems and group access to advantage and privilege ascribed to one based on the identity groups to which one belongs. You know, how close are you to how you identify, what's your social identity, and how does it fit into the structure of the overall situation. And then also we look at privilege as an unearned access to resources in society. And as you can see on the screen, that form with power and privilege. Okay, I'm going to introduce our short video that will look at how power and privilege is being played in how we address homelessness and how we experience homelessness. Diane Nealon is a friend and fellow advocate for families with children experiencing homelessness. In her own words, Diane says, "I've spent 15 years on America's back roads while living in a small RV, chronicling the plight and promise of families experiencing homelessness." Diane is the author of Dismayed and Driven, My Look at Family Homelessness in America, and a filmmaker. Her work brings focus to people who are not able to receive social services because they do not fit the HUD definition of homelessness. Many work, have children, and they do not meet the definition, and they live in motels and hotels across the country, unable to obtain permanent housing for various reasons. Let's view the trailer for her video, Two Mothers Not Homeless Enough.
I've been staying from hotel to hotel for almost 3 months, 7 days in each hotel. I done spent over $8,000 paying for hotels. Okay, I'm trying to keep a job, be homeless, maintain my children and myself at the same time, look for a place, do this, do that. You can't do all that. Sometimes I don't know if I'm coming or going. I have to smile to keep from crying a lot. But don't think for 1 second that we aren't bumping heads and arguing and bickering with each other, because we all are frustrated. The hardest for me is not being able to walk up to the door and put a key in to a place of my own. I have ran across a lot of families that are homeless in these hotels that I go to. And I feel so bad for them and me, because this is terrible. We shouldn't have this hard time finding no apartment. It should be better resources that can help us get into something. It's 3 months. There's no way that I shouldn't be in a place. There's no way.
Our house is burning down. So just like that, we were homeless. We proceed to have a year and a half of hell. So my brother was nice enough to let us sleep on his couch. But again, there's 7 of us. My husband's aunt begged us to live with her, but it was out in the country in another town. We did a trial and we stayed with her for a few days and thought, okay, my kids were happy there. It was a really nice big house for everybody. And as soon as we actually had our stuff there, it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This woman was not a good person. While at the same time, my kids went to a new school district and to this day wish they were still there. They bonded with those kids more than they bonded anywhere in their lives. So I had to pull them away from that a month later. And then we ended up with my mom in a 2-bedroom trailer. We got here to Cambridge in April of 2019. So now we have been homeless for 4 months and enrolled the kids in this school district. So now they're in their 3rd school district in a year. So as far as school, it's been hard for my kids here because they really liked Cambria and they made a lot of good bonds. Riley had her first boyfriend and Leah was actually in a play. And the schools have been amazing to my kids. They've helped them in ways no other school district has. They've come so far. Unfortunately, my older ones have not bonded with anybody. They don't really have friends.
Thank you. Before we go into our small group, we're going to discuss in the small group what has already been shared up until this point, including the video. I'd like to invite Elizabeth in to frame our discussion for us.
Thanks, DeBorah. As we prepare to go into breakouts to engage with one another in dialogue, I want to, DeBorah wants to take a minute for each of us to touch in to the center of you. For those of you who have experienced homelessness personally, think of identify for yourself, how will I support myself to stay present and to be very choiceful about the degree to which I share what I choose to share. If you have not experienced homelessness yourself, how will I hold on to the place in myself where I am compassionate and in a learner stance with humility and open-heartedness?
Thank you. I'm trying to bring up the slide now with the questions. Let's see what's going on here. And then when we're doing that, Phyllis, you're putting people in their rooms.
Yeah, I'm ready to do that whenever you're ready for them to go, DeBorah. And I just wanted to let you know, you also will be assigned to a room when we initially go into the rooms, but you should still have the capacity to be able to move through all of them if you would like.
Okay, I'm looking here now to see where I'm sharing my screen and I'm trying to get to the next. Oh, there we go. Okay, there we are.
And also, DeBorah, how long do you want us to be in our room, the breakout rooms for?
Breakout room is 20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay.
20 minutes. Mm-hmm.
Great. And then what we will also do, if, hopefully people are taking note of the questions at this point in time, but we will also try to get them posted in the breakout rooms as well. So are you ready for me to send everybody to the breakout rooms now?
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Welcome back, everybody.
Okay. I was walking, I was going to say I was walking around, but I wasn't walking around. I was jumping around the Zoom to different breakout sessions. and I was able to hear the rich conversation that was going on and the energy around the topic. And I appreciate all of you who have participated. At this time, we're going to have someone from each group just give us a synopsis of what was discussed in your group and one takeaway from the group. And so we'll start with Minnie's group.
I was the scribe in taking notes. And so we didn't exactly answer all the questions, but we definitely had a very wonderful conversation. So just to share some of what we talked about, how power and privilege is wrapped in judgment, and you must have done something wrong to have a hard time. And a lot of it has to do with outreach in terms of how it impacts outreach efforts. It's difficult to get people involved, but once they do get involved, they're changed forever. You know, most of the volunteers have had a revelation after becoming involved in the outreach efforts and really getting to know people one-on-one. And some of the programs do that pretty closely, is getting, you know, building that relationship. Someone actually said building a family to be able to, you know, get rid of those preconceived notions, finding out individual stories and feeling more connected. And then in terms of efforts to address this, focusing on the cause, not the symptom, and a lot of work on awareness raising to explain what's happening, what's really going on in the communities and how they can help.
Oh, we'll have Elizabeth's group.
LaToya or Carol Ann, I'm going to invite you to summarize. Either one.
Well, I guess I am up since Carol Ann has not spoke. We've discussed a lot, you know, that power and privilege plays a part in all of this. I brought their attention to a video called Segregation by Design. And we ourselves have had assumptions, but come to learn that through experience, whether our own or those of others, it has helped rid those assumptions. And we've come more to better understand the challenges that those of us that have experienced homelessness need to be addressed, you know, such as, for instance, schools have homelessness liaisons, and those liaisons often do not get involved as they should. The housing authorities and the affordable housing that is being built necessarily is not giving the power and privilege that we need to move forth in other aspects of our life and society, to be contributing members of society. You know, I brought up most of my experiences to them about affordable housing, which here in New Jersey, many towns are required to now have. They will have 100 units, but only 30 of those units are affordable housing. That's political power, which unfortunately is an avenue which needs to be broken down as well. I am very happy that the Episcopal Church is, you know, going forth with some measures to assist in this homelessness. Our Lutheran churches, counties, and the Catholic Church has been doing it for years. But in many towns and counties such as where I live, which is considered to be wealthier ones, it's pushed underneath the table. So it really takes, you know, and pride and ego for those of us that have experienced it is a big issue. You know, we don't want to tell people our problems because many times, for me, myself, no one believes it. And it's not always a matter of them looking down on you, but if they don't believe you and assistance is not there, the mental aspect, the physical aspect, all of that is draining, which will affect everything overall.
Thank you so much. We'll now have Valerie.
Thank you so much, Dr. White. Scott Russell was going to do our breakout information.
Yes, I took some notes on our discussion. Very good discussion. We talked a lot about the barriers that face people, especially people of color, especially those of the African diaspora from the beginning. Things like land owning, which has not really been a possibility for those of African descent, especially those who had been enslaved until very recently. So there's actually a really good video called The Unequal Race Opportunity, I think it's called. It's on YouTube. You can watch it, Unequal Opportunity Race. And it just shows how people have been kept, people, especially those, like I said, of African descent, have been kept behind. And there's a lot of systemic and intentional reasons for that. We talked a bit about, we had a nice, I think, sermonette from Father William, and he talked to us about how we must, those of us who see this inequality, the systemic inequality, must surrender our privilege if anything is going to move forward, but we can move forward even one person at a time. We were talking about how we have been manipulated by those in power to believe there is scarcity and to believe that there are no real answers to any of these problems. We've been tricked into believing that we really can't solve any of these issues. We talked a bit about how much having a stability of education and rootedness is part of privilege that we sometimes forget, especially for children, that somebody can have a safe, rooted existence in a school system when moving children around, especially those in a homeless situation, that can really, really disrupt the life and the future of the children. And we talked a bit about the second question of what next in terms of reaching out and doing the outreach. We actually had a live example of two parishes talking to each other about helping each other do a better job of getting the word out. So I think it's a lot of it. We're realizing is networking. If you ask for help and you don't get an answer, ask somebody else. And make networks, and ECS would be a great way for people to get connected, to find out what are the ways to find resources, but also to tell people you have resources.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mary Alice?
I have to confess, we didn't follow the rules. We did not, I forgot to ask for a scribe. And so I'm going to ask someone in our group, one person self-designate, to share the discussion. I will say that in our group, we had a very powerful image of homelessness from the inside out. And our discussion was extremely fruitful, very productive. So would someone please volunteer?
I'm happy to give a quick summary if you'd like. I did not take notes, but I want to first emphasize that we listened to each other. That was one of the requests that I heard from me particularly. Just about all of us had a chance to share. There were sharing of stories of actual experiences of homelessness or near homelessness, that fear of the near homelessness, the terror that happens inside, watching others experiencing homelessness and how that individual was relating to that person at that time. Also, we talked about incorrect perceptions about homelessness and gave some examples of the inability to access housing, just the barriers that are in place. So our discussion wasn't so much a discussion, it was a listening to each other was very fruitful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me, could I just add one thing? And that is, DeBorah, I really want to commend your work. Your emphasis of beyond charity is something that I have taken very, very seriously. And the other reason I want to commend your work is that you are focusing on policy and the crucial role of policy in homelessness. And so I just want to thank you publicly very much for those things.
Thank you so much. We are running out of time, so we're adjusting the rest of the presentation. So what we're going to do, we won't have a second breakout. We have planned that. But what we will do is just talk about a little bit about the Beyond Charity to Transformation, and then I'll share some work that is being done now, and then we'll close it out. So we'll be able to close by noon with your questions. We began our time with a reflection sharing the homeless experiences of Jesus, which lifts the care and charity he received from others along the way. We then spent some time understanding the various ways that homelessness can be defined and experienced. We talked about social stigma, stereotypes, prejudice, and perceptions that people identified as homeless encounter and endure. We thank God that Jesus, based on his housing status, did not face discrimination, criminalization, or have his dignity or rights attacked, or was banned from places he would go based on being perceived as homeless. This scripture helps us to not only view Jesus as someone without permanent housing, but to be thankful for people who give in ways that make life better for individuals and families in need. But to also see Jesus as an advocate and know that there is more that can be done. Our faith in action also makes room for us to support those who are identified as poor, those who are identified as homeless, and those at risk of homelessness to do a new thing by lifting both charity and justice to bring about transformative change. The human rights lawyer, Brian Stevenson, who is mainly looking at systemic change to the criminal justice system, and he particularly works with youth on death row. Brian Stevenson says, the opposite of poverty is justice. And I agree. How can we as people of faith strengthen our advocacy, understanding what social justice advocate Mckinney-Vento White shared with me during a recent conversation, that charity is helpful and supports us in doing good and feeling good, and that advocacy is necessary component to transformative change and can be frustrating. Advocacy can be frustrating. So what I'd like to do is just share what is happening around advocacy work in the community. And one of the first groups I would like to highlight is the work of the Poor People's Campaign. And the Poor People Campaign speaks to poverty and inequality. The campaign challenges the idea that our economy rewards hardworking individuals, and therefore the millions of people in poverty acted better, worked harder, complained less, and prayed just a little bit more. They would be lifted up and out of their miserable conditions. We know that we need more than that. It's led by people of faith and building upon the groundwork of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. This campaign reminds us that over the past 30 years, homelessness has gone up compared to, has gone up, and more people are experiencing homelessness and housing instability. Other work that's being done is the Bring America Home campaign. And Bring America Home now is a national grassroots campaign to end homelessness. It is led by people with lived experience of homelessness and is representative of the collaboration effort among national, state, local groups, agencies, and organizations to work for federal legislation to address interconnected solutions to end homelessness. This campaign lists 5 key areas for bringing about transformative change. 1, the embracing of homelessness as a human right. 2, the link between health and homelessness and overall physical, mental, and emotional well-being. 3, employment providing a living wage or housing income. 4, education and training that equips children, youth, and adults for economic mobility. And 5, viewing homelessness as a civil rights and justice issue. Another effort comes under the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and this is their House campaign. This campaign aims to advance anti-racist policies and achieve the large-scale, sustained investments and reforms necessary to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable and accessible place to call home. Lastly, there's been a move for homeless Bill of Rights across the country. Individuals and families that find themselves without housing should not experience discrimination due to their housing status. Advocates continue to challenge policies and practices across the country that undermine the humanity and dignity of people experiencing and at risk of homelessness. The proposal and passage of Homeless Bill of Rights is a strategy. To date, a few cities and states have passed such legislation, including Illinois, Connecticut, Duluth, Minnesota, Baltimore, Maryland, Madison, Wisconsin. Rhode Island was the first state to pass a HBOR, and Puerto Rico the first U.S. territory to do so. We have pending legislation that will be introduced to the Delaware House of Representatives early next year. My homeless work has been, I experienced homelessness in Delaware, and coming out of that began to work around a Homeless Bill of Rights for the state of Delaware. So this bill was filed on June 8th of this year. And when our legislators come back into session in January, we will be working along with them and in community to get this bill passed in Delaware. We're not going to have the small group discussion, but at this time, I wanted you to see the questions that we were going to ask. And at this point, I'm going to read one last piece to you from my book, and then we'll turn it over for questions. How are we doing with the time, Phyllis?
We're running pretty close to time, DeBorah. I think your suggestion is a great one. After you go, I'm going to read a few things that have already popped up in the chat. I would ask people at this point in time, if you have other questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. If we don't get to actually answering them today, we will definitely take note of them and make sure that we respond to you after we have all of your email addresses from your registration so we can address your questions. Does that sound good, DeBorah?
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to read the short piece and then we'll go back. We'll turn it over to you, Phyllis.
Sounds great.
Okay. The journey through homelessness and its aftermath taught me how fierce a battle it is to dare to ask different questions, have greater expectations, and hold those in power accountable for their treatment of people who hold stigmatized identities in society. People living with mental illness, people living in poverty, people experiencing homelessness, and other vulnerable groups continue to have hope that the day will come where we all will have what we need from a society that values fully who we are.
Thank you very much. And I hope that people will take note of the questions that are up on the screen so that they can be definitely, great food for further thought and conversation back in your congregations. I noted earlier that Henry Richards had posted in the chat. There's a program sponsored by Episcopal Migration Ministries that talks about costing $3,000 to get an Afghan family into a home related to the Afghan refugee program. And he was asking, is there a parallel Episcopal Church ministry that focuses on getting homeless families settled into homes? And my response to that would be, I'm certainly not aware of one, but it's something that it's a great question to ask. It's wonderful that we do the ministry with the refugees, and that's a much needed ministry. But a lot of times we don't look at the refugees that are even within our own shores. So thank you for that question, Henry. I appreciate that. I also just wanted to draw everybody's attention to a number of the resources that have been posted in the chat. Again, we will give you a summary of these in our follow-up email to you. There's some great stuff here. The video Segregation by Design. Scott Russell also posted a video, so we will make sure that you get those, as well as the links to the videos that we showed here today. I think I'm looking through, I don't see, I see Denny Higgins was asking about sharing the resources. Yes, we will definitely do that. Just a lot of appreciation being expressed for the things that were shared in the breakout rooms. And I was bouncing around kind of like DeBorah was, and was also just deeply moved by the things that I was hearing, the stories that were coming out. So thank you all so much for opening your hearts and really engaging with the conversations that we were having today. And with that, it's back to you, Derek.
Thanks, Phyllis. I get to introduce our closing speaker, but I just wanted to, from the bottom of my heart, thank Dr. DeBorah and all her crew. We can do a little silent clap here. Just so inspiring. You've left us with spirit and courage to fight for justice. And the last thing I would say is that, for some reason, God chooses to work through us and use our hands. So often, sometimes we listen to these things and we kind of go home and think about it. But I just encourage us to all see how we can work to end homelessness, because homelessness doesn't have to exist. It's a system that can be changed into a system that houses all people. So I encourage us to do work, whether that's grassroots work in your community, working at a pantry, working at a shelter, doing advocacy, doing policy work, or taking it to the streets and protesting. So thank you. I pray that we all are able to do that work together. And I am excited to introduce to everybody Bishop Stokes, who may not need an introduction, but I'll give a small personal one. It's been such an honor to serve with a bishop who, although is powerful advocate of social justice, is also humble and meek, and I believe truly shows us what leaders in this country should be like. So without further ado, Bishop Stokes.
Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Derek. I am sorry I wasn't able to be with you through the whole thing. I was committed to the Women of Honor event, which honored women who were doing amazing work across the Diocese of New Jersey to meet human need. And so that was a joyous place to be. But this conversation, as I came in on it and heard some of the summary conversations, I think is right where we want to be with Episcopal Community Services of New Jersey. And that is at the intersection of human need and justice. And I have your book, Dr. Gilbert White, and started reading it, and I'm grateful for that work. As many in the diocese know, as an older teenager, I experienced eviction when we were evicted from the apartment I lived in with my mother. I've been through that with the marshals being in the house, and the arguments you make, I think, are all important arguments for everyone to understand. It can happen to anybody. In this country, it's more likely to happen to people of color. And I don't know if you referred to Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, but that the one thing that he said to me that was always so compelling is that in the United States, we have been incarcerating Black men and evicting Black women. It's all systemic, and we need to be mindful of that, and especially those of us who are part of a dominant culture. We have work to do and corrections to make to a system that is unjust and evil, in fact. So I thank you. Thank you for your work, and I thank everyone who was part of this particular conversation so that we can begin to reframe these issues as we need to do. And I'm very grateful to the Advisory Committee of Episcopal Community Services and the Reverend Joan Mason and Charisma Ubiera, to Phyllis Jones as our staff liaison who keeps things going all the time. Derek, thank you for hosting this particular event. We need to keep the conversation going. And more important, we need to do more than be in conversation. And again, I think through Episcopal Community Services at the Diocese of New Jersey, we find a way to both do the work, have the conversations, and from contemplation to action. From contemplation to action. So with that, The clock is chiming. It's noon. I don't think there's anything else to do but pray out. Yes, am I right? Let's pray. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which have divided us for so long and continue to divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease. That our divisions being healed, we may strive for justice and peace among all people and walk humbly with you. The blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit be upon you and remain with you this day and always.
Amen.
Thank you all so very much.
Thank you. There is a survey in the chat. If you will please just click on that so that when we are dropped off this call, you will have the survey. And please fill that out and let us know what you think.
Well, thank you everybody so much. It was great seeing you. We hope to work with you. And thank you, Dr. DeBorah.
Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful day. If for any reason you have trouble with the survey link, it will also be in a follow-up email. So blessings to all. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your weekend.